Thank you. So, forgive me if you were here yesterday, because I'm going to tell the same story as I did yesterday, which is of a time that is not that dissimilar to, sadly, the one we're going through. 1930s in Britain. We had, in 1920, a rule we weren't going to go to war again, says Winston Churchill. At that particular moment, he said, we're not going to go to war again for 10 years. And that was actually carried on and moved forward each year to the early 1930s, when finally Britain woke up to the fact that the world is a very different place. We're going to have to spend some money on re-equipping our armed forces. Chamberlain, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the early 1930s, quite rightly in many people's eyes, says, look, we'll spend the money on the Air Force and the Navy first. Army's only going to be important to Britain if the first two fails, because we're an island. You know, if we can defend the skies, defend the seas, the army's only going to be there if they cross the channel. So we hadn't spent much money on tanks. We'd done some great experiments in the late 1920s up on Salisbury Plain. We led the world with tactics, and the Vickers Medium, great tank there, but actually we need, they're wearing out, and we haven't got enough of them. So we start 1934, a chap called Hugh Ellis. He'd been in charge of the tank corps in World War I. He starts as Master of Ordnance a program of tank design and development. He thinks we're going to need tanks to go forward with the infantry, hence the phrase, an infantry tank. A bit like World War I, crush down the barbed wire, thick armour, it's going to cross battlefields with machine guns firing, barbed wire shells coming down. But we're also going to need cruiser tanks. They're going to be faster. Once the hole is punched in the front line, they're the ones for speed and exploitation. All these ideas we've been experimenting in the 1930s. First infantry tank that was designed is coming on now. We can't, because this is the only one left that's running, we can't let it go round too many laps, so I'll talk about it now, even though others are coming as well. And this one is the Matilda 1. They start the design with Sir John Carden of Vickers in 1935. It really is a bit of a crude vehicle. The overall budget, I think, was something like 6,000 guineas to get this one out there. And they get the tractor gearbox from a Fordson tractor. They get a Ford V8 petrol engine from a car, put it in the back. They do all these things to try and keep the cost down. What they do, though, is they put really thick armour on the front of that vehicle and a 303 machine gun in most of them. Two-man crew, one guy in the turret, commander, he's got to sit on the floor to operate the radio. Driver you can see in the front, hatch open, the only way you can see where he's going. If he closes that, he's got a tiny little periscope. That goes into service at the end of the 30s, and it's already getting the design for its replacement is going on, which is the tank behind it, the Matilda 2. So one of the problems Britain had in the 1930s is to find the factories that can actually, now we've got the money to start building some tanks, where can we do it? So they go to railway companies, they start up, there's a company called Vulcan that used to make, it was a foundry that helped make steam engines. They go with a design that becomes the Matilda II. Vulcan are actually really good, they put it together in a couple of years, which is not a bad time to design and build a tank. But there are issues. These are complex vehicles that take a lot of skill and a lot of machinery to make.
Music, okay.
So the Matilda I and Matilda II, they see action with the British Expeditionary Force in France in 1940, and famously a battle at a place called Arras, where the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments sweep down the hillside from Billy Ridge and go into the flank of the 7th Armoured Division, the Germans there, who were advancing under Rommel to the coast. Really panicked the German army at that particular moment until Rommel comes back, establishes a gun line, some 88mm to stop these tanks. But it gave breathing space to Britain to be able to reinforce Dunkirk, Boulogne, Calais. We saved our army. So even though they're a modest tank, they really had an important part in basically saving Britain and of course then Europe at that particular time. We had an army still, therefore, to fight with. We dropped making the Matilda I, the very small one. We carried on making Matilda II, but the emphasis from 1940, Churchill says, carry on making the tanks in the factory you've got now, but our main effort, of course, went on fighter planes and bombers to get back to Germany. Tanks went on the back burner. They were grade 2 in the list of priorities for Britain in 1940 and 1941. So as manufacturing Britain concentrated on those aircraft, and of course the Navy is still vitally important to get us all fed, we went to the Americans to start saying, can we buy tanks off of you? Can you make tanks to our designs? Just as the French did with the Charles B. The Americans very sensibly said, I'll tell you what, instead of building your tanks, why don't you come in with our tank program? They were about to build a tank called the M2, a medium tank. They stopped that and realised they needed a bigger gun on it, so they built this tank that's leading on, the M3. For British service, it's called the Grant. In American service, they called it the Lee. Slight differences between the two. We paid for the first half of these, and then the famous Lend-Lease comes in from Roosevelt, where he's able to give us tanks on the never never, as it were. Now the grant, they've already decided they're going to have an aeroplane engine. They think they're going to need a 75mm gun. They really want to build the next model, the Sherman, with a turret on the top. But at that particular moment in time, they didn't have the skills. So they put the gun, the big gun, in the side, in what they call a sponson. They're copying the French Charbie, they're copying the British Churchill tank as well when they're doing that. And it's really an interim model. A chap called Carr, a British designer, he changes the top turret out in America. He does a new design of that top turret because we like the radio in the top. That's another big difference. The Americans put the radios in the hull. We end up fighting in North Africa. There's about 600 of these ready for the Battle of Alamein. And they make a really big difference to the British contribution or the British fighting troops there at that time. So enormously important, that American ramping up. Initially, don't forget, with British money, we paid for those first American tank factories that are put up. And we're just running out of money. We put in billions of pounds worth of orders for guns, tanks, etc. We're just running out of our gold reserves that's when Roosevelt manages to get Lend-Lease going as well. America against, not in the war at that early period. So the grant, really important. Everything you say about the grant, different factories they have to go to. Some are riveted together like this one. Some factories learn the casting. And there's not enough of those radial aeroplane engines. You hear it when it moves off. It sounds like an aeroplane there in the back. Not enough of those engines, so they start using other types of engines as well, which is exactly what happens also with the Sherman tank later on. Now back in Britain, Vickers have gone to the War Office and said, listen, we can put you together a tank nice and quick. War's coming, and they do that with a tank called the Valentine, the next tank that just behind the Grant that's moving off there. And the Valentine, we're really lucky today, that's what we've got. It's a version of it, quarter of our tank production, by the way, with Valentines in World War II. 8,000 of those were made, we tend to forget about them. They were great because they were reliable. Vickers used components that were already out there. And even though it started with a 2-pounder gun, they were able to upgun it. It was really tight inside the turret, but they ended up there with a 2-pounder, then a 6-pounder, then a bored out 6-pounder gun. They called it the quick firing 75mm. Could fire the same ammo as a Centurion. And again, commonality, things like that, really important that way. This one was used as a DD, duplex drive, 2 ways of driving. When it goes past, if you look under that canvas that goes round it, at the back there's a propeller. And that's because we wanted to float a tank. We started the idea with the Tetrarch. Nicholas Strausler, guy working in Britain, Hungarian origin. If you put a canvas screen up, you can make anything float. So it's Archimedes' principle there. They use this one, the Valentine. We train with it, but we don't actually go to war with it. We use a Sherman DD. Main reason, look at that long gun out the front. If you see that, it overhangs the front, so you can't, the gun has to be going backwards if you use the screens. And they worried about that on D-Day. We want those floating tanks to come ashore, fire straight away at the enemy positions. Sherman with a shorter gun, screen could be up and gun could still be forward. But that particular one, restored by John Pearson, they're here today, wonderful restoration job, really rare vehicle, but it's a good representative example of the Valentine tank that we can seize action North Africa, really important for Britain at the time, alongside things like the M3 Grant here. Now this particular Grant, new to us, lovely to see here at Bovington, part of the Bill Bannister collection, is actually the markings. After we used it in North Africa, the Americans used very few of them for a little while in Tunisia. The rest of the production we basically either gave to the Russians or they went out to the Far East to fight the Japanese, or in India, Burma. This one ended up going to Australia, and Australia trained on them. It's in the markings of the 1st Australian Armoured Brigade unit. They were ready to defend Australia if the Japanese had made it. They didn't actually see fighting service when the Australians went island hopping and fighting abroad again. They took Matildas with them instead of the Grants there. So, but a fantastic bit of kit there that we can look at there, and you can hear that aeroplane engine in the back. We talk about it throughout the day. Firepower, mobility and protection, three things that make up a tank. Mobility is depending on the oomph of your engine, and using a radial aeroplane engine, you can hear that there, it sounds like a plane taking off. That's giving you a level of power that most other engines just couldn't reach at the time. Enormously thirsty though, as you can imagine. You're drinking your way through fuel. A couple of laps here, probably down on some of these tanks. So the 75mm, the Americans had realised they've been watching what's happening in Europe. Let's get developed from the First World War 75 gun. They put in the tanks there, and the development of that gun is what's going to go on the Sherman a little bit later. Now in 1940 in Britain, we had Matilda 1, Matilda 2. You immediately start, as soon as the tank goes into service, even before that, you start designing the next one. And our next infantry tank was going to be the Churchill. 1940, we got lessons coming back from France, they changed the design, they rush it into production, it's put together in a year, and it has faults because of that. We haven't got time to test things, etc. And in our archive, the first manual with the very first Churchill tanks, the first page says, listen lads, we know this has got faults, but we think it's better you have it now in case that later the Germans might have crossed the channel. You know, we had to get it out to the troops. So it has lots of problems early on. But as they're ironed out, this becomes actually a very, very reliable and a very good tank. It's got tremendously thick armour. The Mark 7 version that you see fighting in Normandy has got thicker armour on the front than the German Tiger 1. It's reliable, which for a tank crew is great. It means you can get a night's sleep. You're not having to work on it all the time. And again, we up-armour it and we up-gun it. First Churchill tanks, those type, some of them you'll see at Dieppe, 2-pounder guns, 3-inch howitzer in the hull, just like again the Grant, you know, the idea of putting a gun in the hull, it's not new. What they do though, this is a Mark III, and we put the 6-pounder gun on, and again later those bored out 6-pounders, 75mm ones. This is the type, this is a Mark III Churchill, 600 odd built. Again, they move on, and those marks means that there tends to be an improvement or a different model of it all. So the Churchill we've got coming around here, a bit of a rarity, used of course not just to help the infantry attack on the infantry armour brigades, but it's also the basis for lots of specialised armour. 79th Armoured Division uses for D-Day. Things like the Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineer, the AVRE. Inside the museum you can see our AVRE, Petard mortar on the front for knocking out pillboxes, versions to carry a bridge, a fascine. We've got the Crocodile of course, with the basically a tank full of napalm on the back that they pressurise and squirt out the front, really frightening weapon. So it actually saw really impressive service. Debate about, it's called the Churchill, was that after the Prime Minister? Might be actually named after one of the earlier Churchills, Duke of Marlborough. But again, famously, Winston Churchill, when it had trouble, typical, they've named it after me because it's no damn good, that's what he said at the time. But a really impressive bit of kit there, the Churchill tank. And another one, look into it, it has a really impressive service life. Tunisia famously climbs up hills, goes places tanks just weren't expected to go. And because it's got doors on the side, really good for the engineers to use. Sacks full of explosives, drive up to the wall, they can be protected as they jump out, lay a charge, and then retreat off, blow a hole in a wall or a pillbox, things like that, you know, so it has a really good story there behind it. Now down the other end, complete other, it seems like, in terms of scale, we've got a wheeled bit of British armour. And again, in England or Britain, we rather like beating ourselves up. The Germans always had the cool stuff, we didn't, did we? Utter tosh. In Britain, we were great at wheeled armour. And there's a lovely example. The Germans had nothing like that. If they captured it, they reused it. The Italians copied it when they captured one. They made something called the Lynx. They thought it was great. And it's something, this one's a Daimler Dingo. We've got a Daimler armoured car. Wheeled British armour, very, very good. This one is like the sports car of armoured cars. It has in the back a Daimler straight six petrol engine. That will get you up to about 55 miles an hour on the open road. It can go just as fast backwards as forwards, which if you're doing the recce roll, imagine it, if you meet the enemy coming the other way, you want to get out of trouble. You've got a Brent gun if that. Okay, so you're not there for fighting, you're there for finding out where the enemy are. The most important weapon on that vehicle would be its radio, because it's the information it's giving the main force coming up behind. So very, very impressive bit of sophisticated wheeled armour. Pre-selector gearbox, fluid flywheel, Daimler armoured car, the bigger one with the turret on the top. You know, that's got disc brakes. It's got amazing technology at the time that we were putting out there. And so, interestingly, when the Americans came along with a couple of their armoured cars on offer, including the one that's driving around now, the M8, put it bluntly, the British kind of turned their nose up a bit. Not sure we really want this one, sort of thing. The M8 armoured car, the other end there, it was going to be a tank destroyer to replace basically the Americans had put a 37mm anti-tank on the back of a truck. They knew they needed something better than that. So they put together three companies. Ford wins the deal, and this is put together by the Ford company. It just isn't, by the time it's ready, it's certainly not worth trying to take on enemy tanks with something like that. So they use it for reconnaissance instead. Downside of it, great on the road, really powerful engine. Again, over 50 miles an hour on a good straight road. Cross country, no good. Mud, really poor. And even worse, if you go over a mine, the belly plates have very thin armour. So even though this is actually, this particular one is in British markings, we only used them just a little bit at the end of the war. We didn't really like them so much, especially as we got much better wheeled armour of our own. M8, crew of 4, 2 guys in the front, 2 in the turret, and you got the radio in there. And why it's such a familiar vehicle, because the Americans had quite a number of them, I think 6,000 made, they were passed on after the war. So there's countries in Africa, South America, still with them in service today. They were used for internal security. There was a version with the turret off the top called the M20, more like an armoured personnel carrier. So they're still around, an amazing tribute to that mass production and reliability of some of those vehicles there. Now swapping back to tanks, we have that period where we're building, as I mentioned, the tanks that are still in the factories. We've got better designs. 1940, the 6-pounder guns ready. Keep making the 2-pounder, says Churchill. We can't risk stopping production in case the Germans invade. So we don't get the 6-pounder in a tank till 1942, even though it's been ready a lot earlier. We're developing an engine as well to give our tanks in the future more power. We're going to see, we hope later on, the Spitfire coming over, the Merlin, fantastic bit of power in a plane. We put it on the Lancaster. A wonderful guy, what a name, Rusty Rowbottom, works for Rolls-Royce, gets a couple of crashed engines, fiddles through them, says, hang on, I think we can make this go in a tank. And after a fair old bit of work, and he's only allowed crashed engines, by the way, because we're so important that those engines, the real new ones, get to the RAF. He then develops it as a tank engine, and we call it the Meteor. We were building a tank that was going to replace our Crusader tanks. It was going to be a medium cruiser tank. We ended up making 3 models in case that Meteor engine wasn't ready. And the one that's at the far end there, we tend to look at it and think it's a Cromwell tank. Actually, that one, they called it the Centaur because it got an earlier engine in. And when they were building these, they were building them with the engine bay in case we could swap the better engine we know is coming, this meter engine, 680 horsepower, really powerful bit of kit. This is the earlier version. This one wasn't swapped over. It's still got the Liberty engine in the back there. But this is the tank that we end up using. We hope it was going to be ready in 42. We don't actually use it until 44 when we go across with the D-Day landings. Some Centaurs went, but they were being used by the Royal Marines. If you have the chance, as you go out to Normandy, you'll see a few of these behind the beaches. They have painted lines around the turret. That was because they were going to be used on landing craft coming ashore. At one point, they were going to take the engines out the back, fill that full of ammunition. Don't worry about it, we'll just drive the landing craft in and they can be doing fire support onto the beaches. Montgomery says, hang on, that's a bit of a waste there. Put the engines back in. So all the poor guys had to put the engines back in and they drive them ashore as part of the Royal Marines Armoured Support Unit. And the marks on the painted on the outside is so people could radio in and start saying 5 degrees right, there's a target there for you, can you get that out for us? They were supposed to be only on the D-Day landings +1, 6 weeks, they're still fighting later in Normandy. Crewed by Royal Marines, driver was always a Royal Tank Regiment guy on loan to them. Now this one, lovely to have this because it represents really that Cromwell family, and yet again that story, when we use our Cromwells with the meters in the back, looks pretty much the same as this. They end up going faster and further from the Seine River up to the Dutch border. They did that quicker than the Germans did in 1940 coming the other way, and that's because they had a powerful engine and a lick of speed. So sometimes lighter armour, speed can be just as useful on the battlefield compared to what we're going to see a little bit later when we go the other way with things like the King Tiger. Whopping great gun, massive thick armour. As Montgomery said, if the Germans had had these tanks at the back of the Bulge, they'd have got to the coast. They didn't, thank goodness. Now, another tank. We are developing a new cruiser tank in the background in Britain. It ends up, it's going to be a world beater, but we've got that classic design issue of things always take a bit longer than expected. So meanwhile, they get bits of the Cromwell and they build an interim tank. That's the one behind it. That's called the Comet. So it's using about 60%, maybe more, of Comet parts, but it's got that meteor engine in the back. You listen to that. That's that powerful engine from the Spitfire. It's got a punchier gun on it. This is something called the 77mm high velocity gun. The round that comes out the edge is the same size as the 17 pounder. It's exactly the same round. The shell package with the propellant pin actually comes from an anti-aircraft gun. Slightly smaller so we can manoeuvre it in the turret. Thick armour still, thicker than what we had on the Cromwell, the Centaur, the Cavalier series. So it was a very effective bit of kit, and we kept it to the troops in about December of 1944. That's just when the Germans had their attack at the Battle of the Bulge. So what they do is they take those tanks back off the 7th Armoured Division and reissue them with Shermans, because they thought if you're going to go and meet a load of German tanks, much better you're in kit you know and you're used to than something new that you're not quite familiar with yet. Issued again in January, and they see service to the end of the war as a Comet. Very effective. That 77mm fine discarding sabot, a slug of tungsten, pop round the outside. We've got access to tungsten, the Germans less so. That gun firing can penetrate more armour than the 75mm on the famous German Panther. So, you know, this is an impressive bit of kit, easy to overlook. Doesn't see much action before the end of the war, but again, it goes on. We use it, we carry on with the British Army, and it's sold on to lots of other countries, Finland, Burma was still using it into the 1980s. I think I mentioned yesterday, if you look at the rear of that tank, on the original designs they were going to have a silencer for the engine, and some very sensible engineer ended up saying, forget it, it's not worth doing. So all you've got is two big pair of exhausts, because you're going to hear this coming. And of course, don't forget, that's part of that psychological effect of the tank. You're sitting in a foxhole somewhere and you hear that rumbling away in the distance, you're going to know, you're going to feel it, aren't you? So two British cruiser tanks from the end of the war, and the tank I was telling you about, the really important one, we're going to see a little bit later. It doesn't quite make it in time to see action, but as I say, it does become a well-being